Whiskey Outpost, Afghanistan. A place where darkness doesn't just come from the night, it rises from the ground, consuming us in nameless terror. It was Whiskey Outpost, a lonely speck on the map of Afghanistan, where dust and howling winds were our only companions. We, the Green Berets, were stationed there for a mission no one wanted to talk about, maintaining a presence. It sounded official, but in reality, we were just bait, waiting for something terrible to descend upon this desolate wasteland. From the very first night, I sensed something was wrong. It wasn't the usual artillery fire or the distant echo of machine guns. It was the eerie silence that overwhelmed every sense. The darkness at Whiskey Outpost was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was thick, heavy, almost tangible. Our flashlights barely pierced through it, casting only feeble beams of light that made the abyss around us seem even deeper. During my night watch, I began hearing strange sounds. Soft footsteps, too light to belong to any of us, echoed through the empty hallways. Faint whispers, as if someone was speaking just beside me, but when I turned around, there was no one there. At first, I chalked it up to nerves, or maybe the wind carrying strange noises through the dunes. But the occurrences became more distinct, more terrifying. On the third night, while patrolling outside the outpost, I saw the darkness move. Not the shadows of trees or shifting objects, but the darkness itself, slithering across the ground, spreading like a living thing. I blinked, convincing myself it was just my imagination. But no, the darkness was still there, and it was creeping toward me. A chill ran down my spine. I knew then something horrifying was happening at Whiskey Outpost, and we, soldiers who were trained to be fearless, were utterly powerless against it. At Whiskey Outpost, Helmand Province, Afghanistan. The daytime heat could soar to 45 degrees Celsius, but when night fell, the desert cold seeped into our bones, chilling us to the core. We were stationed in a crumbling fortress, once an old subborder checkpoint, abandoned since their invasion. Bullet-riddled stone walls, rusted metal roofs creaking with every gust of wind. All around us, nothing but sand and rock, no trees, no signs of life. At first, everything seemed normal, if the mind-numbing monotony could even be called normal. Patrol, guard duty, radio check-ins, then more patrols. But as night deepened, an oppressive weight settled over us. Strange noises became more frequent, no longer just footsteps and whispers. We heard objects crashing in the abandoned storage room, chains dragging across the ground, and soft, heart-wrenching sobs echoing from the small graveyard behind the outpost, the burial site of nameless Soviet soldiers. Sergeant Miller, the most battle-hardened among us, initially dismissed it as paranoia, but even he started to feel uneasy. Our communications equipment constantly malfunctioned. The radio crackled with static, cutting in and out, and sometimes, between the noise, we heard voices, mutters in Russian, fragmented commands, and agonized moans. One night, while Johnson and I stood watch at the Eastern Guard Post, we saw it, a figure moving between the layers of barbed wire. Tall, clad in an ashen gray uniform, moving unnaturally fast, almost gliding across the ground. We froze, loading our rifles and aiming at the darkness. "Who's there? Stop!" Johnson shouted, his voice unsteady. But the figure did not stop. It vanished into the night, dissolving into the air. We reported it to Sergeant Miller, but he only shrugged, saying we were probably seeing things. But Johnson and I knew better. We had seen it, a soldier's ghost, wandering the perimeter of Whiskey Outpost. Fear spread through our unit. No one patrolled alone at night anymore. We always moved in pairs, backs pressed together, scanning every shadow, dreading what lurked within. But the darkness at Whiskey Outpost had eyes. It watched from the corners, emerging just long enough to instill terror before slipping away again. Then came that fateful night, the night when the nightmare truly began. The night we realized Whiskey Outpost wasn't just abandoned, it was cursed. The night when the darkness didn't just move, it attacked. It was Ramirez and Davis's shift. Around 2 a.m., gunfire erupted from the Western Guard Post. The radio was dead silent. Sergeant Miller immediately rallied us, weapons ready, and we sprinted toward the outpost. When we arrived, the guard post door stood wide open, flashlights rolling on the ground. Ramirez and Davis were gone. No signs of struggle, no explanations. Only a thick metallic scent in the air and a bone-chilling cold wrapping around the post like a shroud. We spread out, calling their names, but the only response was the howling wind and an eerie, suffocating silence. By sunrise, they were still missing, as if the darkness had swallowed them whole, erasing all trace of their existence. That was when we knew Whiskey Outpost was no longer just an outpost, it was a death trap, and we were already caught inside it, with no way out. After the disappearance of Ramirez and Davis, Whiskey Outpost was engulfed in an atmosphere of grief and terror. Sergeant Miller tried to remain calm, but I could see the unease in his eyes. We knew this was no longer a trick of the imagination. There was a dark force lurking here, and it was hunting us. We tightened our defenses. Guard shifts were reinforced, patrols shortened, and we never moved in groups of fewer than 3. By day, we maintained a facade of normalcy, training, checking weapons, and contacting the base for orders. But at night, fear crept in, tightening its grip around our hearts. That night, Johnson and I were assigned to guard the warehouse. It was a decaying structure, its rusted metal roof riddled with holes, its rotting wooden door creaking with every gust of wind. Armed to the teeth, we swept our flashlights across every shadowy corner, trying to ward off the darkness that surrounded us. Around midnight, as we patrolled the back wall of the warehouse, Johnson froze, gripping my arm. "Do you hear that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. I held my breath and listened. A strange sound echoed from inside the warehouse. Not the usual clatter of falling objects or the dragging of chains. This was laughter. High-pitched, shrill, unsettling, like the laughter of a child, yet laced with something sinister and cruel. The laughter grew louder, filling the silence. Our flashlights flickered, their beams weakening as if something was draining their power. The darkness around the warehouse thickened, pressing in on us. A bitter, rotting stench filled my nostrils, making me gag. Johnson shuddered, mumbling, I don't like this." Neither did I. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but we were Green Berets. We didn't run. We faced the unknown. I signaled Johnson to move forward, gripping my rifle tightly. Step by step, we advanced toward the warehouse door. The laughter echoed louder, closer. Just as we reached the entrance, the rotting wooden door swung open on its own, revealing a pitch-black void, and the laughter was coming from inside. I switched on my flashlight and aimed it into the darkness. The weak beam barely cut through the void, but what it illuminated made my blood run cold. Suspended in the air at the center of the warehouse was a shadowy figure. Not the ghostly soldiers we had seen before. This was something bigger, something grotesque, a monstrous entity formed from pure darkness and smoke. Its limbs were unnaturally long, tipped with razor-sharp claws. Its face was twisted, inhuman, with glowing red eyes that burned like embers. And it was laughing. The sound pierced through the air, a nightmare-given voice. The creature slowly turned its head toward us, locking its fiery eyes onto ours. An invisible force pressed down on me, crushing the air from my lungs. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Beside me, Johnson dropped to his knees, clutching his head and screaming. The shadow beast opened its gaping maw, revealing jagged, shark-like teeth. A jet of black mist spewed from its mouth, rushing toward us. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for death. But instead of pain, I felt an unbearable cold, like my soul was being torn from my body. And then, everything faded into darkness. I don't know how long I had been unconscious. When I opened my eyes, I found myself lying on the cold ground of the warehouse, with Johnson motionless beside me. The faint morning light seeped through the holes in the rusted metal roof, dispelling some of the terrifying darkness. The shadow creature was gone. The eerie laughter had ceased. Only the heavy silence remained, along with the lingering stench in the air. I shook Johnson hard, calling his name over and over. After a while, he finally let out a faint groan and opened his eyes. His face was pale, drenched in sweat, his gaze unfocused. "We're still alive?" he whispered hoarsely. I nodded and helped him sit up. Both of us were trembling, still in shock, as if we had just survived a horrifying nightmare. We crawled out of the warehouse and made our way back to the main area of the outpost. Sergeant Miller and the others were waiting for us, their faces filled with worry. When they saw us return, they let out a sigh of relief, but as we recounted what had happened, their expressions grew tense and fearful. There was no more doubt. Whiskey Outpost was truly haunted, and we were facing a supernatural force beyond human comprehension. We sent an urgent report back to base, detailing everything and requesting an immediate evacuation order. At first, they didn't believe us, assuming we were suffering from extreme stress. But when we attached the audio recordings and blurry images we had captured, strange noises, shadowy figures, they began to grasp the severity of the situation. The evacuation order came swiftly. We packed our gear, loaded the trucks, and left Whiskey Outpost under the pale morning light. No one spoke. We carried with us an unshakable sense of dread, an imprint of something we could never forget. As the Humvee rolled through the outpost gate, I turned back one last time. Whiskey Outpost still stood there, desolate and abandoned, beneath the glaring sun. But I knew that the darkness still lurked within its crumbling walls, waiting for its next victims. And that eerie laughter, perhaps it still echoed in the air, haunting those who had ever stepped foot in that cursed place. We left Whiskey Outpost, but Whiskey Outpost never left us. The nightmares followed me every night, visions of the shadow creature, the sinister laughter, and the hollow faces of Ramirez and Davis. They hovered in my mind, refusing to fade. I knew that no matter where I went or what I did, I would never forget what happened at Whiskey Outpost. That place had carved a deep scar into my soul, one that might never heal, because I had come face to face with true darkness. A darkness that doesn't just exist in the night, but lurks in forgotten places, in abandoned battlefields, and in the terrifying memories of war. And sometimes, that darkness rises, swallowing us into an abyss with no end. The Iraqi desert, where mirages become reality, and the past rises from the dust, swallowing us into a nightmare with no escape. We were Bravo Team Green Berets assigned to escort a supply convoy to Forward Operating Base FO Mustang, deep within the desolate Anbar Desert of Iraq. It was a routine mission, so dull it made us sick. But this time, something felt different, an unease creeping through the scorching desert air. The first day passed without incident, just sand, sun, and the roaring engines of our Humvees. But at night, as we set up camp in the vast emptiness, strange things began to happen. During the night watch, Private Miller reported seeing headlights in the distance, moving parallel to our convoy. At first, we assumed it was an Allied patrol, but when we attempted radio contact, no one confirmed any activity in the area. By morning, as the sun climbed high, we spotted those same headlights again, still flickering on the horizon. This time, we could clearly make out the shapes of military trucks, old, dusty, and moving at an unnatural speed, unaffected by the rough desert terrain. Our squad leader ordered us to accelerate, attempting to either catch up or at least identify the mysterious convoy. But no matter how fast we moved, the distance between us never changed. That eerie convoy seemed to maintain a precise gap, as if it were toying with us. And the strangest part? Through our binoculars, none of us could see any drivers or soldiers inside. They were just lifeless machines, racing across the desert like ghosts. By the second night, the encounters grew more frequent and more terrifying. The ghostly convoy no longer kept its distance. It drew closer, surrounding us from all sides. Their blinding headlights pierced through the darkness, and the roar of their engines drowned out every other sound. And in that blinding light, we began to see them, faint figures behind the wheels or standing in the truck beds, spectral soldiers in tattered mud-stained uniforms, their faces hollow and haunting. The appearance of the ghost convoy was no longer an illusion or a trick of the imagination. It was real, a terrifying reality encircling us in the heart of the Iraqi desert. Fear spread like an epidemic through our convoy. Even battle-hardened soldiers began to lose their composure, shaken and afraid. Our commanding sergeant struggled to maintain formation, ordering us to keep our speed steady and maintain a safe distance from the ghostly trucks. But they followed no discernible rules. They moved with unnatural speed and agility, effortlessly traversing towering sand dunes and treacherous rock formations. At times, they would close in on us, mere meters away, only to vanish into the night, only to reappear from another direction, surrounding us once more. The following nights were pure terror. The ghost convoy grew more aggressive. No longer content with merely encircling us, they began to attack. Their blinding headlights pierced into our cabins, disorienting us. Their horns wailed incessantly, shattering the desert silence with an ear-splitting shriek. And worst of all, they opened fire. But the bullets from the ghost convoy were not real. They were spectral rounds, passing through our vehicles without leaving a trace, yet inflicting horrifying effects. Our Humvees shook violently, as if struck by an invisible force. Our electronics flickered and failed unpredictably, and more terrifying still, those ghost bullets seemed to pass through our bodies. Private Johnson, seated next to me, was struck in the chest by one of them. There was no blood, no wound on his skin. But he collapsed, gasping for breath, his face drained of color, moaning in agony. We frantically checked him, but there was nothing physically wrong. All he could say was that he felt an icy current surge through him, ripping apart his insides. Johnson grew weaker by the hour, despite our desperate attempts to help him. On the fourth night, he died inside our cramped Humvee, under the eerie glow of the ghost convoy's headlights. His death was a crushing blow to our morale. Fear had turned to hopelessness. We knew now that we could not fight this phantom force. These were ghosts from the past, and they were hunting us to the bitter end. On the fifth night, the ghost convoy launched its most ferocious attack. They surrounded our vehicles, forcing us into a narrow canyon. There was no way back, no escape. We knew this was the final battle. Either we destroyed them, or we would be consumed by them. The sergeant ordered us into a combat formation, preparing for the fight. We armed ourselves with heavy weapons, machine guns, grenade launchers, everything we had. We were determined to fight until our last breath, even though we knew survival was nearly impossible. The ghost convoy advanced, their blinding headlights piercing through the darkness, engines roaring loud enough to drown out our racing hearts. We could now see the ghostly soldiers inside the vehicles more clearly. Their faces were pale and hollow, their eyes dark voids like bottomless pits. Their uniforms were tattered, caked in dirt and dust, marked by battles long past. They were the spirits of soldiers who had died in the wars that had ravaged this land, returning for vengeance, or perhaps simply to drag us into the abyss with them. As the ghost convoy closed in, we opened fire. Bullets tore through the air, but it was useless. They passed through the spectral vehicles as if shooting at mist, causing no harm. In contrast, the ghostly bullets fired back at us with terrifying force. Our Humvees shook violently, windshields shattered, metal twisted and buckled. My comrades fell one by one, their screams lost in the chaos, struck down by invisible yet lethal rounds. I was hit, one shot in the shoulder, another in the leg. Agonizing pain seared through my body, but I forced myself to stay on my feet, to keep fighting. I knew it was futile, but I couldn't surrender. I had to fight until my last breath. In the chaos, I saw the sergeant being dragged from his vehicle by a ghostly soldier. He struggled, screaming for help, but it was useless. The spirit pulled him into the darkness, his final cries echoing through the canyon. Then Private Miller was taken. Then Private Garcia. One by one, my squad was torn away, swallowed by the ghost convoy. In the end, I was the last one left. I stood alone in the canyon, surrounded by the wreckage of our Humvees, the bodies of my fallen brothers, and the ghostly vehicles encircling me, waiting to finish what they had started. I knew my fate was sealed. There was no escaping this place. I would become part of Whiskey Outpost, part of the ghost convoy, a wandering spirit doomed to roam the deserts of Iraq forever. I closed my eyes, waiting for the final moment, but instead of pain, I felt an eerie silence. The roaring engines of the ghostly convoy gradually faded, and the blinding headlights dimmed. When I opened my eyes, the phantom convoy had vanished. All that remained was the stillness of the desert and the first light of dawn breaking on the horizon. I didn't understand what had happened. Why did the ghostly convoy suddenly disappear? Had they spared me? Or was this just a brief calm before another storm? I struggled to my feet, checking my wounds. My shoulder and leg still ached, but there were no visible injuries. It was as if the phantom bullets had only inflicted pain on my mind rather than my body. I looked around, searching for any sign of my comrades, but they were all gone. The wrecked Humvees remained, yet the bodies of Johnson, Ramirez, Davis, the sergeant, Miller, Garcia, they had all vanished, as if they had never existed. I stood alone in the vast desert, without a single soul in sight, without any trace of life. I knew I had survived, but the price was too great. I had lost my entire team, lost my sanity, and lost my faith in reality itself. What I had experienced in the Iraqi desert would haunt me forever, never letting me go. I walked across the desert, not knowing where I was going. I only knew that I had to leave this place, leave that deadly canyon, as far behind as possible. I walked and walked until exhaustion overtook me, and I collapsed into the sand. When I woke up, I was in a field hospital, surrounded by doctors and nurses tending to me. They told me that a patrol unit had found me, dehydrated and barely conscious, hundreds of miles away from FRB Mustang. I tried to tell them what had happened, about the ghostly convoy, the spectral soldiers, and the disappearance of my team. But no one believed me. They said I was suffering from combat trauma, that everything I saw was just a hallucination. They insisted that no other convoy had been operating in the area at that time, and there were no reports of any incidents involving my unit. I knew they would never believe me, and perhaps that was for the best, because the truth about the ghostly convoy, about Whiskey Outpost, and about the desert's fallen soldiers was a truth too horrifying, too haunting, beyond human comprehension. And sometimes there are secrets best left buried forever in the sands of time. Fort Bragg, North Carolina, May 2024. Before the Humvee was assigned to our unit, no one told me about its past. Perhaps, if I had known, I would have never set foot inside this four-wheeled hell. The M-151 Humvee had just been transferred to Delta Company, 2nd Battalion, 5th Special Forces Group. It had been repainted in desert sand color, but the fresh coat of paint couldn't hide its worn and battered exterior. The frame was scratched, the windshield was cracked, and the interior carried a musty, unpleasant odor. According to its service records, the vehicle had spent years in Iraq and Afghanistan, enduring countless fierce battles. They said it had witnessed terrible things. At first, we didn't pay much attention to the new Humvee. Vehicles were constantly being rotated in and out of the unit. It was nothing unusual. But just days after its arrival, strange things began to happen. It started with the sounds. Even with the engine off, we could hear faint creaks and rattling noises from inside the vehicle, as if something or someone was shifting around inside. But every time we checked, it was empty. Then came the inexplicable technical malfunctions. The headlights flickered on and off, the radio crackled with static, and the GPS system glitched erratically. The mechanics inspected it thoroughly but found nothing wrong. They insisted the vehicle was perfectly fine, but in reality, it was anything but normal. The soldiers assigned to the Humvee started feeling uneasy. They claimed that whenever they sat inside, they had the overwhelming sensation of being watched, like unseen eyes were staring at them from behind. They felt a chill run down their spine, even in the sweltering heat. And sometimes they caught a fleeting whiff of something burning, an acrid, charred scent like burnt flesh, lingering in the cabin before disappearing without a trace. Our squad leader, a no-nonsense and hardened soldier, initially dismissed these stories as paranoia. He believed we were just letting our imaginations run wild, stressed about the upcoming mission. But then, even he began noticing something was off about the Humvee, and so he decided to dig into its past. What he discovered made our blood run cold. The squad sergeant contacted the logistics depot, requesting detailed information on the Humvee with the designation Delta 25H07. What we received was not just a dry service record, but a horrifying story, a dark secret the military had tried to bury. This Humvee had once belonged to a special reconnaissance unit operating in Iraq in 2007, at the height of the war. The unit was deployed on a classified mission deep into insurgent-controlled territory. During the mission, the Humvee was ambushed. All 4 reconnaissance soldiers inside were killed. The vehicle was severely damaged but later recovered and returned to the U.S. The terrifying part was the report from the recovery team. The bodies inside the Humvee were found grotesquely deformed. There were no gunshot wounds or blast injuries. Rather, it was as if they had been crushed from the inside. Their faces were contorted in agony, their eyes frozen wide in terror, mouths gaping as if screaming in their final moments. And the most disturbing discovery inside the vehicle, deep, frantic claw marks etched into the metal interior, as if someone had desperately tried to escape but failed. After the incident, the Humvee was placed in storage, abandoned for years. Only recently, when the military needed additional vehicles, was it refurbished and put back into service. No one realized that this vehicle carried not only the scars of war, but also the lingering spirits of those who had died within it. Upon learning the truth, fear spread through our unit like wildfire. We began to believe that the Humvee was truly haunted. The strange occurrences we had experienced were not coincidences, but signs of a supernatural force awakening. The eerie noises became more frequent and distinct. We no longer heard just the rattling and creaking, but also whispers, moans, and even faint sobs echoing from inside the vehicle. The headlights no longer merely flickered. They would turn on and off by themselves, illuminating empty spaces as if searching for something. The radio interference became more disturbing, broadcasting strange voices, fragmented military commands, and chilling pleas for help. One night, while Private Garcia was inspecting the Humvee before his shift, he let out a terrified scream and ran from the vehicle. We rushed over to find him pointing at the driver's seat, his face pale as death. "There's blood," he stammered. We looked at the seat and saw fresh crimson stains smeared across the fabric, as if someone had bled out heavily right there. But when we wiped at it, the blood vanished without a trace. The peak of the horror unfolded on that fateful night patrol. The commanding sergeant, Private Miller, and I were assigned to patrol the outskirts of the base using the haunted Humvee. Though we were terrified, we had no other choice. We had to face it and uncover what was truly happening with this cursed vehicle. As night fell, we drove the Humvee out of the base gate and into the desolate wilderness beyond. The air grew unnervingly cold and silent. The headlights illuminated the uneven dirt road ahead, but the darkness seemed to engulf us from all sides. The radio crackled with static, emitting bizarre noises, like someone gasping for breath right beside us. Suddenly, the Humvee's engine sputtered and died in the middle of the road. We tried to restart it, but it was useless. The engine remained completely silent, unresponsive. The headlights flickered off, plunging us into total darkness. "What the hell is this?" the commanding sergeant muttered, his voice filled with unease. And then we heard it. Not the engine, but a creaking, scratching noise coming from inside the vehicle. The sound grew louder, more frantic, as if something inside was struggling, desperately trying to break free. The Humvee began shaking violently, as though an unseen force was attacking it from within. "Get out, now!" the sergeant shouted, shoving the door open and leaping out. Miller and I scrambled to follow, escaping from the violently trembling Humvee. We backed away, weapons raised, watching in horror. The Humvee's convulsions intensified. The creaking and scratching escalated into agonized screams and tortured wails. Suddenly, the headlights flashed back on, blindingly bright and terrifying. In the blinding light, we saw cracks spidering across the windshield, spreading rapidly. Then, with a deafening shatter, the glass exploded outward, scattering shards in all directions. From inside the Humvee, something black and viscous slowly emerged. It wasn't human, nor was it any recognizable creature. It was a thick tar-like substance, grotesquely oozing and writhing, as if formed from pure darkness and unimaginable terror. The black mass slithered out of the Humvee, spreading across the ground, surging toward us with unnatural speed. We opened fire, unloading our magazines into the amorphous black entity. Bullets passed straight through, doing nothing to stop it. It kept advancing, growing larger, more horrifying with each passing second. An icy chill washed over me, and a putrid stench filled my nostrils, making me gag. I knew, in that moment, that we couldn't fight it. We were about to be consumed by the ghost lurking within the Humvee. The sergeant let out a terrified scream before turning and running into the darkness. Private Miller trembled as he backed away, but tripped over a rock and fell to the ground. The black, tar-like substance lunged forward, engulfing him in an instant. Miller let out a blood-curdling scream, then silence. The entity continued slithering toward me. I knew there was no escape. I closed my eyes, bracing for death. But instead of pain, I felt an unbearable cold, as if my soul was being ripped from my body. I felt myself being pulled downward, sinking into an endless void of darkness. Then everything went silent. When I opened my eyes, I was still standing there, facing the now motionless Humvee. The black substance had vanished. The night still surrounded me, but the terror was gone. Only silence remained, along with the lingering stench of decay. The sergeant returned, panting, his face pale with horror. He frantically looked around for Miller, but there was no trace of him. "Miller, where is he?" he asked, his voice trembling. I shook my head, unable to speak. We both knew Miller was gone, consumed by the ghostly force within the Humvee. We rushed back to the base and reported everything. This time, no one doubted us. They saw the fear in our eyes, heard the tremor in our voices. The haunted Humvee was sealed away, sent back to storage, never to be used again. The sergeant and I were reassigned to another unit, leaving that base forever. But what happened with the cursed Humvee never left us. We knew that some things in war defy logic, that supernatural forces exist beyond human control, and sometimes of war carry not only death and destruction, but also vengeful spirits and curses from the past. And the Humvee bearing the designation Delta 25807 would forever remain a horrifying reminder of that truth. Hindu Kush Mountains, Afghanistan, September 2024. We came here to hunt down flesh and blood enemies, but what we awakened was an ancient nightmare buried deep within the mountain. Alpha Team, Green Beret Special Forces, was assigned to scout a remote cave system in the Hindu Kush Mountains of Afghanistan. Intelligence suggested it could be a hidden Taliban stronghold, a cache for weapons, and a staging ground for future attacks. As seasoned soldiers, we were no strangers to danger, yet an eerie unease crept into my gut. Perhaps it was the unforgiving terrain of the Hindu Kush, or maybe it was the chilling tales whispered by locals about cursed caves. The cave we sought lay hidden within a deep ravine, concealed by towering rock formations and treacherous winding paths. Reaching it required hours of trekking through rugged terrain under the relentless high-altitude sun. When we finally arrived, we stood before a gaping black maw, an abyss that seemed to stare back at us like a watchful, unblinking eye. Despite the scorching heat outside, the air around the cave entrance was unnaturally cold. A damp, metallic stench filled my nostrils, making my skin crawl. A presence lurked here, ancient, malevolent, and far beyond human comprehension. The sergeant gave the order to move in. We checked our gear, flashlights, weapons, and comms, ensuring everything was in working order before stepping into the abyss. The moment we crossed the threshold, darkness swallowed us whole. The beams of our flashlights flickered weakly, struggling to pierce the void. We could barely make out the slick cave walls, twisted stalactites, and shifting shadows that seemed to breathe in the suffocating blackness. The cave in Afghanistan was unlike any I had ever known. It was not just dark and damp, but carried an oppressive, suffocating presence, as if an invisible force was pressing down on us. The air inside was thick and heavy, making it difficult to breathe, and the deeper we ventured, the colder it became, an icy chill that seeped into our bones. We moved cautiously, slowly, following the winding, jagged tunnels of the cave. Our footsteps echoed eerily in the silent space, bouncing off the deep rock walls in strange, distorted patterns. Apart from our own movements, there was nothing. No wind, no running water, no insects. Only an unnatural silence that wrapped around us, suffocating our senses. As we delved deeper, strange occurrences began. Our flashlights flickered erratically, as if their power was being drained. The radios crackled with static, frequently losing signal, and at times we could hear faint whispers bleeding through, ancient like unintelligible sounds spoken in a language none of us recognized. Private Garcia, leading the formation, suddenly froze and screamed in terror. "Something! Over there!" he stammered, pointing ahead. We aimed our flashlights in the direction he indicated, and what we saw sent chills through our spines. Suspended in the middle of the cave corridor was a ghostly, flickering figure. It was neither human nor beast, but a strange, pulsing mass of light. Wavering, shifting, like a spectral fire floating in the darkness. It emitted unsettling noises, moans, labored breathing, and a spine-chilling, shrill laughter. We stood motionless, paralyzed by fear, watching the strange apparition. No one dared to move, no one dared to speak. We knew this was no natural phenomenon. This was something supernatural, an ancient force lurking within the cave. The glowing mass began drifting toward us, closer, larger, more menacing. An unbearable cold washed over my face, and a foul, rotten stench filled my lungs, making me gag. A crushing weight pressed down on my body, paralyzing me, stealing the air from my lungs. Primal fear took hold, gripping my heart in a relentless vice. As the glowing mass drew closer, we could see its form more clearly. It was no longer a formless light. It began to shift, to take shape, becoming a grotesque, nightmarish creature. A towering, muscular figure, yet its head was that of a goat, with long, curved horns and eyes that burned red like embers. Its skin was black and rough like tree bark, exuding a nauseating stench of decay. The creature, the keeper of the cave, stared at us, its gaze filled with fury and malice. It growled, producing ancient, guttural sounds, a blend of an animal's roar and something far more supernatural. I felt as if something was reading my thoughts, invading my mind, planting seeds of terror and madness. Despite his fear, the sergeant in command struggled to maintain composure. He ordered us to open fire, to attack the keeper. We unleashed a hail of bullets upon the monstrous entity. The rounds tore through the air, striking its massive body, but to no effect. The bullets passed through as if through smoke, causing no harm. Instead, the keeper retaliated. It raised a clawed hand, sharp talons extending, and from its fingertips, a dark, crackling energy surged forth. The energy shot through the air like lightning, striking Private Garcia, who stood right in front of me. Garcia screamed in agony, convulsing violently before collapsing. I rushed to his side, but it was too late. His body lay lifeless, his face twisted in horror, eyes rolled back, mouth frozen in a silent scream. Garcia's death struck a devastating blow to our morale. Fear spread like an infection, paralyzing us. We realized that our conventional weapons were useless. We were up against something beyond human comprehension, a supernatural force we had no means to fight. But surrender was not an option. We were Green Berets, trained to face the most dangerous situations. We had to fight, to the last breath. The sergeant ordered us to switch tactics, engaging in close quarters combat with knives and smoke grenades to disrupt the keeper's vision. We split into two teams. The sergeant led a frontal assault, while I led a flanking maneuver to strike from behind. Smoke grenades erupted, shrouding the cave in a dense fog as we charged forward. I lunged at the monstrous being, dagger in hand, aiming for its throat. But my blade met something unyielding. As if stabbing solid stone, it did nothing. Instead, the keeper swiped at me, sending me hurtling several meters, crashing hard against the cave wall. Dazed and in pain, I forced myself up, only to witness my team fighting in vain. Knives, grenades, none of it had any effect. The keeper was too powerful, too terrifying, far beyond anything we had ever faced. One by one, my squad fell. The keeper crushed the sergeant's skull with its monstrous grip. Private Miller was torn apart, his blood splattering the cave walls. Private Davis had his life force drained, his body shriveling into a dry, lifeless husk within seconds. In the end, I was the only one left, alone, standing amidst the bodies of my fallen comrades, with the keeper towering before me. An immovable force, its fiery red eyes locked onto mine, waiting to strike the final blow. I knew there was no escape. I had failed. Alpha Team was annihilated, and the keeper of the cave, the ancient darkness lurking beneath Afghanistan's mountains, had emerged victorious. I knelt down, dropped my dagger, closed my eyes, and awaited death. But instead of pain, I felt an eerie silence. The growls of the cavekeeper ceased. The foul stench vanished. When I opened my eyes, the cavekeeper was gone. The cavern had returned to its original darkness and silence, with only the lifeless bodies of my comrades sprawled across the cold, rocky ground. I didn't understand what had happened. Why had the cavekeeper suddenly disappeared? Had it spared me? Or was this all an illusion, a cruel trick of the mind? I slowly crawled to my feet and checked my injuries. My entire body ached, but there were no fatal wounds. It was as if everything that had just happened was nothing more than a horrific nightmare. But the bodies of my fallen comrades, the stench of blood thick in the air, reminded me that this was no dream. It was real, a terrifying and undeniable truth. I was alone in this death-filled cave, the only survivor. The mission had failed. Alpha Team was annihilated, and I was the only one left alive. But for what? To carry the horror and trauma of this experience for the rest of my life? I decided to leave the cave, to find my way back to base and report what had happened. I knew no one would believe me. They would think I was insane, delusional. But I had to tell the truth, whether they believed me or not. because the truth about the cave keeper, about this cursed Afghan cave, and about the dark supernatural forces that lurked here was a warning, a reminder that there are places in this world where mankind should never tread, and this cave in Afghanistan was one of them. I staggered out of the cave, leaving behind the bodies of my comrades and the haunting memories of what had transpired. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. I would never forget what happened in that cave. That place had taken everything from me, my brothers in arms, my faith, and even my sanity. And the darkness of that cave would haunt me forever until the day I drew my last breath. Afghanistan, Pakistan border region, October 2024. Nightfall over this desolate mountain range brings not only darkness, but also eerie sounds echoing from the realm of the dead. We, Cobra Team, part of the Green Berets, were conducting a border patrol mission along the Afghanistan-Pakistan frontier. This area was notorious for its treacherous terrain and the strong presence of Taliban forces. But tonight, the threat did not come from a visible enemy. It came from something unseen, something far more terrifying. As night fell, we split into two smaller groups to begin our patrol. I was with Sergeant Miller and Private Davis, while the other group, led by Sergeant Garcia, patrolled in the opposite direction. We maintained communication via radio on frequency 243 MHz, the emergency backup channel. At first, everything seemed normal. The wind howled through the mountain passes, boots crunched over loose gravel, and the faint static of the radio hummed in the background, familiar sounds of a routine border patrol. But then, around 2 a.m., my radio began picking up strange noises. It wasn't the usual interference, but something distorted, eerie, like whispers, choked and strained, as if someone was trying to speak but was being suffocated. I adjusted the frequency, checked the antenna, but the strange sounds persisted. They grew clearer, louder, taking on the form of voices. "Someone's talking on our frequency," I reported over the radio to Sergeant Miller. "Doesn't sound like Taliban chatter." Sergeant Miller was silent for a moment before replying, "I don't hear anything. My radio is fine." Private Davis confirmed the same. Only my radio was transmitting these strange noises. A sense of unease crept over me. Maybe my radio was malfunctioning, or maybe someone was deliberately jamming our frequency. But the sound, it wasn't normal interference. It carried an unsettling resonance, as if it came from somewhere impossibly distant, somewhere cloaked in darkness. The strange sounds from the radio became clearer and more terrifying. The distorted whispers gradually turned into moans, gasps, and faint cries for help. I could distinguish different voices, men, women, children, all in pain, despairing, as if trapped in a horrific nightmare. I tried to contact Sergeant Garcia and his team through the radio, but no one answered. My radio only transmitted the desperate cries for help, growing louder, more frantic, as if trying to drown out all other sounds. Sergeant Miller and Private Davis were now genuinely worried. They could see the panic in my eyes, and soon they too began to hear faint, eerie noises coming from my radio. Maybe it's Russian interference, Sergeant Miller tried to reassure us, though his voice trembled. Or some kind of Taliban psychological warfare. They could be trying to scare us. But I knew this was not interference, nor was it a prank. This was something else, something dark and supernatural. The voices from the radio became more coherent. I began to make out fragmented but haunting words. "Help, help us. We're trapped. The darkness, don't come closer." The voices pleaded, begged, warning us of some unspeakable horror lurking nearby. I realized these voices did not belong to the living. They were the voices of the dead, fallen soldiers, trapped in some ghostly realm, desperately reaching out to us through the radio, trying to warn us of something terrifying. Fear engulfed us. We had no idea what we were facing, but we knew it was dangerous, something beyond our comprehension. We decided to retreat, to abandon the night patrol and return to base. But as we turned around, we realized we were lost. All around us was only darkness and jagged rocks. There was no sign of the path back. And the cries from the radio grew louder, more insistent, as if luring us deeper into the darkness. Come to us, we're waiting for you." The voices called, beckoning us, promising something. But I knew this was no invitation. It was a trap, a curse, waiting to swallow us into an abyss of horror. We tried to find our way back, but the further we went, the deeper we got lost in the desolate Rocky Mountains. The radio continued to echo desperate cries for help, luring us down an aimless path. Sergeant Miller tried to turn it off, but it was useless. The sound was no longer coming from the radio. It was coming from the air itself, from the darkness surrounding us. The static-filled screams had become part of the environment, overwhelming our senses. Then we saw a light. Ahead of us, between the towering cliffs, a faint, flickering glow appeared, like a will-o'-the-wisp floating in the night. "Someone's there!" Private Davis exclaimed, relieved. "Maybe it's Garcia's team!" We rushed toward the light, hoping for help. But as we got closer, we realized it wasn't a campfire, nor was it a flashlight. It was an eerie, unnatural glow emanating from a small cave hidden behind large boulders, and the cries from the radio, they seemed to be coming from inside that cave. Don't go in there." A panicked voice echoed in my head, as if someone was whispering directly into my ear. It was one of the voices from the radio, the voice of a young soldier filled with terror and despair. "It's a trap. They're waiting for you. Don't come closer." But it was too late. Sergeant Miller was already leading us toward the cave entrance. He believed Garcia's team might be in danger inside, and we had to rescue them. Davis and I had no choice but to follow him into the dark and foreboding cave. The moment we stepped inside, the darkness swallowed us whole. The faint light from the entrance vanished completely, replaced by a thick, suffocating blackness that felt almost tangible. The cries from the radio grew louder than ever, echoing through the cavern as if coming from every crevice, every stone wall. And then we saw them. Not Garcia's team, but the ghostly figures of soldiers. Dozens, no, hundreds of spectral warriors hovering in the air, surrounding us from all sides. They wore tattered, mud-stained uniforms, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes dark voids like bottomless pits. They were the voices from the radio, the spirits of fallen soldiers, trapped between worlds, searching for new companions. The ghostly soldiers moved closer, tightening their circle around us. They carried no weapons, made no direct attacks, but their presence, the bone-chilling cold radiating from them, and their anguished cries created an atmosphere so terrifying, so suffocating, that we could barely breathe. Sergeant Miller desperately tried to contact the base through the radio, but it was useless. The only response was the overwhelming chorus of desperate screams, drowning out all other sounds. He ordered us to fire, to drive the ghosts away. We opened fire in unison, unloading our weapons into the apparitions, but the bullets passed through them like they were nothing but mist, leaving them unfazed. The spirits kept advancing, closing in tighter and tighter. Panic peaked. We knew we couldn't fight them. They weren't enemies of flesh and blood. They were supernatural entities, vengeful souls seeking to drag us into their abyss. Private Davis collapsed, clutching his head and screaming in terror, completely losing his sanity. Sergeant Miller gritted his teeth, gripping his rifle tightly, but his eyes betrayed his hopelessness. I felt myself breaking as well. The fear, the helplessness, and the crushing sense of isolation weighed on me, draining every last bit of my will to fight. I closed my eyes, waiting for the inevitable. I knew our fate was sealed. We would become part of this cursed cave, part of the ghostly battalion, doomed to wander the darkness for eternity. But then, a miracle happened. Just as I felt myself being consumed by the darkness, the distressing cries from the radio suddenly fell silent. The chilling cold that had engulfed the cave vanished. The ghostly soldiers hovering around us began to fade, dissolving into the air like wisps of smoke. The cave returned to silence, with only the faint whisper of the wind echoing from the entrance. I opened my eyes, bewildered, scanning my surroundings. Sergeant Miller and Private Davis were still there, panting, their faces pale but alive. The ghostly soldiers had disappeared. The static-laced screams from the radio were gone. Only silence remained, along with an inexplicable sense of relief, as if we had just escaped a terrible nightmare. We didn't understand what had happened. Why had the ghostly soldiers suddenly vanished? Had their cries for help been answered? Or had we somehow passed the final test of this cursed cave? We had no answers, but we knew one thing: we had survived. We had escaped the deadly trap of the screams from the radio static. We hurried out of the cave, desperately making our way back to base. This time, we didn't lose our way. It was as if an unseen force was guiding us, leading us back to the world of the living. When we finally reached base, we reported everything to our commander. They didn't believe us, dismissing it as hallucinations caused by stress and exhaustion. But they couldn't explain the disappearance of Garcia's team, the patrol unit that had vanished without a trace that night, and the screams from the radio static. They still haunt me. Every time I hear the faint hiss of a radio, I remember those desperate voices, the hollow-eyed ghost soldiers, and that terrifying cave on the Afghan border. I know that no matter where I go or what I do, I will never forget what I experienced. Because I have heard the screams of the dead, and I have seen the darkness of war, not just on the battlefield, but in the spirit world, where the souls of fallen soldiers remain trapped, and their cries for help will forever echo through the radio static. Fallujah, Iraq, November 2024. Watchtower number 3, known as the Death Post, became my personal hell on earth. I am Sergeant Ben Carter, a marksman with the Green Berets, deployed to Fallujah, the cursed city of Iraq. My mission was to secure and guard Watchtower number 3, a crumbling structure perched atop an abandoned building, overlooking the most brutal combat zone in the city. This watchtower has a terrifying history. During the Second Battle of Fallujah, it was the hideout of a legendary American sniper known as the Grim Reaper. They say he took down hundreds of enemies from this very spot, striking fear into the insurgents. But in the end, he too fell, killed by an enemy mortar strike. The soldier I replaced warned me that Watchtower number 3 was not a place of peace. He spoke of strange noises at night, footsteps on the creaky wooden stairs, whispers carried by the wind, and the eerie sensation of an unseen presence lingering nearby. He jokingly suggested that the spirit of the Grim Reaper might still haunt the tower, guarding the battlefield and searching for a successor. I dismissed it with a chuckle, thinking he was either messing with me or suffering from stress. But on my very first night at Watchtower number 3, I felt it. Not just the desolation and cold of an abandoned ruin, but a deep, unsettling presence, an eerie sensation that someone or something was watching me from the shadows. I kept glancing around, checking every corner of the watchtower, but found nothing. Only the wind howling through shattered windows and the flickering darkness swallowing everything whole. The following nights at Watchtower 3 became an endless nightmare. The strange occurrences grew more frequent and unmistakable. I began seeing movements at the corner of my eye, dark figures gliding through the hallway, faint silhouettes appearing and vanishing in an instant. But when I turned to look directly, there was nothing, as if it had all been a trick of the mind. But the sounds, those were no hallucination. I heard heavy, deliberate footsteps on the creaky wooden staircase, as if someone were climbing up to the watchtower. Yet when I checked, the staircase was completely empty. I heard whispers, soft, hushed voices speaking right beside me. But when I listened closely, the words were distorted, meaningless, and without an identifiable source. And then, the cold, a bone-chilling draft constantly engulfed the watchtower, despite the warm weather outside. I felt an invisible hand brushing against my shoulder, a ghostly touch at the nape of my neck, sending shivers across my body. Sometimes, I could sense someone standing directly behind me, breathing heavily against my skin. But when I turned around, there was no one. I began to believe the warnings of my predecessor. Perhaps the spirit of Grim Reaper truly lingered within the watchtower. And perhaps he wasn't just guarding this place. He was searching for something. Or someone. Fear took hold of me. I no longer dared to stare into the darkness. I clung to my flashlight, though I knew its weak beam couldn't push back the true shadows enveloping the tower. I barely moved. I remained pressed against the wall, gripping my sniper rifle tightly, my eyes darting around, scanning for any sign of the unknown presence. One night, as I stood watch alone, the disturbances escalated beyond anything I had experienced. The footsteps on the staircase became relentless, echoing as if an entire group was ascending toward me. The whispers grew distinct and direct, calling my name, murmuring threats, temptations, eerie promises. In the cold, it seeped deep into my bones, as if I were freezing from the inside out. The peak of terror came on the 7th night of my watch at Watchtower number 3. That night, the sky over Fallujah turned unnaturally dark. Thick black clouds swallowed the moonlight, plunging the city into an abyss of shadows. The wind howled violently through the broken windows, producing eerie, ghostly wails. Inside the watchtower, everything descended into chaos. My flashlight flickered erratically before dying completely, leaving me in absolute darkness. My radio crackled with heavy static, emitting strange, unrecognizable noises. The sound of footsteps on the staircase thundered like rolling drums, as if an entire army was ascending the tower. The whispers escalated into screams, wails, and maniacal laughter, hundreds of voices surrounding me, tormenting me, driving me mad. And then I saw the ghost. No longer just fleeting shadows or hazy figures at the edge of my vision. It was there, clear, present, standing before me in the suffocating darkness of the watchtower. A tall figure clad in tattered, mud-stained military fatigues. Its face was obscured by the shadows, but I could feel its gaze piercing through me, cold, hollow, and haunting. It was him, Grim Reaper, the spirit of the legendary sniper who had perished in this very tower had returned, seeking me, searching for a successor. He moved closer, step by heavy step, like a specter emerging from the depths of hell. An invisible force pressed down on my body, suffocating me, paralyzing me with sheer, unrelenting terror. "Who are you?" I stammered, my voice trembling. The ghost did not answer. It simply kept approaching, raising a skeletal, icy hand toward me. And in that hand, I saw it, an all-too-familiar sniper rifle, the M40A1, Grim Reaper's legendary weapon. He extended it toward me, gesturing for me to take it, as if he was passing down his legacy, as if he was offering me the title of death, as if he was inviting me to become one with the eternal darkness of Watchtower number 3. I reached out with trembling hands and touched the cold sniper rifle. The moment my fingers brushed against it, a chilling current shot down my spine, piercing deep into my bones. I felt an unfamiliar presence invading my body, seizing my mind, controlling my every action. I looked down at the rifle in my hands and realized that it was no longer the M40A1. Instead, it had transformed into a grotesque weapon, pitch black, pulsating with an ominous glow as if forged from shadows and blood. I knew that if I accepted this rifle, I would become the next Reaper, inheriting the legacy of the fallen sniper and forever binding myself to Watchtower number 3. I would become a ghostly soldier, cursed to wander in the darkness, instilling terror in anyone who dared to set foot here. But I also knew that if I refused, I would never leave this place alive. The Grim Reaper would not let me go. He would kill me and make me part of his phantom army. In that moment of life and death, I thought of my comrades, my family, everything I had fought and sacrificed for. I could not surrender to the darkness. I could not become a monster. I had to fight to my last breath to protect my soul, to hold on to my humanity. With a defiant roar, I shoved the sniper rifle away, forcing the specter of the Grim Reaper back. I staggered, pressing my back against the wall and drawing my combat knife, ready to face him. The ghost let out an enraged howl and lunged at me, its clawed hand raised high, poised to strike me down. But at that precise moment, a brilliant light burst from the east, slicing through the suffocating night. Dawn had arrived. Sunlight poured into the watchtower, dissolving the darkness, searing away the lingering phantoms. The Grim Reaper let out a scream of agony before vanishing into the air like a wisp of smoke. The footsteps, the whispers, the sinister laughter, all fell silent. Watchtower number 3 returned to stillness, with only the faint howling of the wind outside the shattered windows. I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath, exhausted and shaken. I had survived. I had defeated the Grim Reaper. But I knew my battle was far from over. The darkness of Watchtower number 3 still haunted me, and perhaps it never would let me go, because I had faced the Reaper and seen the deepest abyss of my own soul. Thank you for watching till the end of the video. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our next terrifying tales. Leave a comment to share your thoughts or suggestions to help us improve. See you in the next video. And have a peaceful night.